try to get a lawyer and really fight it because it's outrageous. It really is.
Though it may not be a fun ride, so far it's a free ride. But a bill now pending could change all that. County jail inmates may have to pay their way. Rent payments for prisoners. It's on the docket for this week's Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process is made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding is provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual, publishers of print and electronic information for and about the legal community, including the legislative manual.
Is it just plain fair or just plain ridiculous? Should a prisoner pay his way? I'm Raymond Brown, and on this edition of Due Process, we ask if an inmate should have to pay rent. We'll meet the author of a bill that says yes and an inmate advocate who insists no. But first, here's Sandra King with a view from inside.
Raymond, in recent weeks on Due Process, we've gone inside a state prison, inside a kids' boot camp, and this time inside the Morris County Jail. There we found nearly 300 inmates crowded into some 65-year-old cell blocks, almost all of them astounded at the thought that someone wants them to pay for the privilege of being there.
No, not in this jail. Definitely not in this jail. I could see if the jail was a little better off, maybe.
Did you really?
Yeah, if it was better off, if maybe the food was even different. This place is like a hellhole.
Prisoner complaints are nothing new. They're usually quick to tell you about the food, the conditions, the discomforts. But now in New Jersey's county and city jails, inmates have something new to gripe about. They may soon be asked to pay daily rent for the privilege of being imprisoned in places like this.
I would never in a million years pay rent in any jail. I don't care what jail it is.
Hey, lady, what's up?
It could be every municipal and county jail in the state under the terms of a bill that's already voted out of committee, a bill that would allow the cities and the counties to charge up to what it costs them to house an inmate. In Morris, that's up to $100 per day.
If I had to pay, nah, I wouldn't do it.
Maybe you wouldn't have any choice?
Well, it's the same thing with people that have to pay child support.
Same thing.
They're in jail.
How much would you like to see them pay?
I want to be realistic. I would say at least maybe $10.
Both Camden and Atlantic counties are already demanding that inmates pay their way, and word has spread northward. Protests have too.
They want us to pay for this. They want us to actually pay for this. Look at this. This is ridiculous.
You say you're, innocent until proven guilty, and you put them in jail on a $100,000 bail, and they can't make bail. Then you're going to charge them to be here.
Innocent until proven guilty.
You haven't gone to trial?
No.
But under the proposed legislation, inmates like this one awaiting trial wouldn't have to pay if they were not in the end found guilty. It's one way that the authors of the bill hope they can forestall a constitutional challenge. But the inmates tend to have less lofty concerns.
We discussed it among ourselves, and a lot of us don't have money, so, however they get it.
50 of the prisoners are indigent. So it gives 230 with some kind of money in their account.
You think 230 of them really could pay something?
Oh, yeah. I know they could.
And as proof, the warden points to what his inmates manage to pay each week to the commissary, a jail's equivalent of a company store.
Commissary. Check, please.
This man's just spent $26. He says each week he pays about that much, and jail officials say he's typical.
Anything you need, cosmetic, stamps, deodorant, I love you card, thank you cards, and all kinds of stuff.
At just the Morris jail, the total spent in the commissary just last year, $130,000.
Talk to some of the guards. They will tell you that they do have a little more money than you think they do.
But Jim O'Brien believes the county's claim for rent should only come second, behind his victims' claims for restitution.
The board was at the top on the old legislation and is now not even mentioned.
Ever since his own daughter Deidre was murdered by this serial killer now in for life, O'Brien's been the state's leading voice for victims. For years as a victim advocate volunteer, since last year as the head of the state's Crime Compensation Board, a board that's been shorted as much as $100 million by convicted criminals who failed to pay their fines.
One gentleman, I think I showed you, had 22 fines against him. He's been in county jail. And he sat in that county jail with 22 fines from 14 different municipalities over 14 years and hasn't paid a dime.
Victims of crime compensation, may I help you?
In fact, every sentence includes a fine of at least $50 or as much as $10,000, all intended to cover the $5 million paid out each year to victims to cover everything from funeral expenses to psychiatrist bills. Some of it's collected by the courts, some by state corrections. But O'Brien, who for months has been lobbying wardens around the state, says the county jails could boost his collections by $1 million or more each year.
The few wardens that I did talk to told me that without any extra expense, extra personnel, they had the capability and were willing to collect those fines in the county jail.
Jim has a good question there. I wish I had the answer for that.
He would like to see you guys collect it for him.
I'd be glad to do it. If the right people make those decisions and implement it, I'll make sure he gets his money.
And the Morris inmates we talked to claimed, at least, that they'd have a lot less objection to making good on victim compensation fines than to paying rent for space on a cell block.
Yeah, I think it's good. I got kids. I think that works pretty good.
That makes sense to you?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Admitted committing a crime, and you know, I felt that was a part of the punishment.
But when it came to inmates paying their way, we could only find one who said he would be willing.
You know, it's part of my duty as an individual to you know, upkeep myself and try to help upkeep the taxpayers of their tax not going up.
The days of a free ride of just coming in here and eating 3 meals and getting a free doctor's visit and getting your teeth fixed, I think they're history.
And whether it's collecting cash to pay their way or those fines meant for victims, the commissaries could be the key. The Morris warden told us that if the rent bill passes, he'll take the money out of commissary accounts. And Jim O'Brien plans to ask the State House for a special tax on all those commissary candy bars, what he calls a victim's assessment of 8% on both the yet-to-be-tried and the convicted. So it looks like there is more than one hand, Raymond, looking to reach into inmates' pockets this year.
Sandy, when we come back, we'll hear from both sides of the rent dispute here in the studio and from an outspoken inmate and her warden remote from the Morris County Jail.
Inmates paying rent? Where are they going to get the money from?
They're not in there because they want to be in there, so why would you pay?
If he is guilty and he's in jail, he's supposed to pay the rent.
Put them to work, pay rent.
It's like a hotel. When you go, you got to pay.
Where are they supposed to get the money to pay the rent?
They committed the crime. They should have to pay the time as well.
Nothing's for free. Why should they have it?
I think they need to work a little harder and not get so many freebies.
You don't stay there and just, eat and do nothing.
You make up your mind how to punish these people, and you punish them. Rent is not part of the package.
Still, public opinion tends to be with Assemblyman Weingarten's legislation. Of course, Audrey Bomsey, director of the Prisoners Self-Help Clinic at Seton Hall Law School, says public opinion should not be the standard of what's fair and constitutional. And Tammy Bartell at the Morris County Jail says she wouldn't pay to live in a jail cell no matter what the law required. Welcome to all of you. Let me start with you, Assemblyman. First, tell me, what is the status of this legislation? Where does it stand?
The legislation has passed the Assembly Law and Public Safety Committee and is ready to be introduced on the floor. And we're looking to have that done hopefully within the next 30 days or so.
When would you anticipate that the governor would sign this bill?
Well, clearly after legislation passes in the lower house, it would still need to go through committee and pass in the Senate.
But how much time would you estimate?
I would certainly hope this session, certainly before November of this year.
And the heart of this legislation is what, in your opinion? What's the critical part of it?
It's common sense legislation, Ray. It basically calls for seeing that those who commit crimes against society not to have two torts against society, not only the initial crime that's committed, but also to make society pay for their incarceration. Everyone in New Jersey today is complaining about the height of property taxes. There's no reason for us to make sure that property taxes have the additional burden of carrying prisoners who have already assaulted society.
Are your concerns equally with punishment and with reimbursing society for the dollar cost, or is one weighted more heavily than the other in your mind?
I think that there are really three objectives that we're looking to achieve. The first is to make sure that those who commit crime are off the streets. The second is to make sure that there's recompense not only to victims of crime, but also to society as a whole in terms of covering the cost of that crime. And the third, of course, is to make sure that there's deterrence, to make sure that no other individuals are willing to commit similar offenses.
Now, Ms. Bomsey, our sense is that the public supports this legislation, and your response is that that's not the test. What is their test, in your view?
The test is whether it's rational for society. I don't think it makes good sense economically or politically, this legislation. I think it has to be seen in the broader context. In the United States, we see incarceration as the solution to all sorts of social ills, from alcohol abuse, drug abuse, mental illness, homelessness, joblessness, alienation. So we lock up a whole lot of people who don't need to be behind bars. Now, what most of these people have in common is that they're poor. In fact, in the county jails, most people are there only because they're guilty of being too poor to raise bail. Now, if you look at specific examples, for instance, Judge Imbriani, he was charged with and later convicted of stealing $173,000. I don't believe he served a day in the county jail. He was able to raise bail. Now, you take a welfare mother or a crack addict who shoplifts a coat for $173. That person may not be able to raise $500 bail and may be sitting in the county jail
so you think
for
it's,
2 and 3 months.
This is an argument that works against those who are already economically disadvantaged.
Exactly. It's a modern-day poor tax.
Ms. Bartel, I want to tell you that I've been in county jails throughout the state of New Jersey. I haven't seen one that I'd pay a dime to stay in. What's your view about this legislation?
Well, I actually think that we shouldn't have to pay the money because a lot of us in here shouldn't really be in here. Take instance for a motor vehicle, to stay into jail and just work off a fine of $25 a day. And then if people do come into the jail with no money, how are they going to take rent or food money from the inmates? Everybody thinks that, you know, new inmates that'll come into the jail won't have any money, and then what are they going to do, go have to back to court? So our issue is really tough in here, and besides, the money they want to charge us is $1.25 a day and $3 for room and board. I think that if people were to do that, we should at least have a choice in what meals we're going to have instead of what they feed us, which is a bunch of garbage.
Assemblyman Weingarten, how do you respond to the concept that's been advanced, I think, by both Ms. Bomsey and Ms. Bartel, that in fact these are people who are obviously among the least economically powerful in society, and that we're taking away from them resources that maybe I'd rather have them come out with $200 than with nothing. They might be better off to start a new life.
Assemblyman O'Toole and I, in sponsoring this legislation, took that into account in three ways. The first is that we take into account the fact that there can be a sliding scale in terms of a means test. To the degree to which individuals can't pay the full freight, counties would have the right, as would municipalities, to set what they deem as an appropriate rate. Secondly, keep in mind that these are individuals who have committed crimes. These are not individuals who are staying at the Holiday Inn, nor should they be treated as if they are. These are individuals who have harmed members of society. That's the law of our state in New Jersey. And if we don't have recompense sought, another crime is being committed. And thirdly, we should keep in mind that even if one doesn't have funds to pay at a given point in time, this legislation allows for liens to be imposed not only upon property that these individuals own, but also upon their future income stream.
One of the things you mentioned as a purpose was to compensate, or that there's a need for society to get paid back because it's been victimized. But in fact, in Sandy King's package, it's fairly clear that the Victims Crime Fund isn't getting any of this money, and now wants on top of this to propose an 8% tax. So in fact, this legislation isn't designed designed to compensate victims either en masse or individually?
It's a question of how we define victims. I would view society as a whole, and certainly the taxpayers in given counties, as victims because they must continue to pay for the room and board for these individuals. In terms of the specific individuals of an offense, keep in mind that we are in no way looking to dismantle the Victims' Crimes Act. In fact, if anything, what we're looking to do is to supplement it, to make sure that victims see that there is a true burden that has to be borne if one commits an offense, both to the individual who's assaulted as well as society as a whole.
Well, the current position of the Victims' Crime Fund, I think, is they should be first before the counties are paid back. Is that something you would accept as a change in legislative priorities?
The bill specifically is silent on the issue of priority in terms of queuing of payments, and we would certainly be willing to entertain any proposals in terms of order of payment or how to divide it. But right now, it's most important to keep in mind, Ray, that the primary funding source should be the prisoner. That's the thrust of this bill, and those funds are not duly being collected either for victims or society as a whole.
Ms. Bartel, let me direct another question to you. I'm sure our viewers will have seen Sandy King's report in which she showed prisoners buying food from a commissary. I'm sure there are some people who would say, look, if you can afford to buy toothpaste or candy from the commissary, you can afford to pay. How would you respond to that?
Well, that's another issue that all of us girls are talking about up here, is that if people do have commissary money, they'll take the commissary away from the people and pay for room and board, which nobody really thinks that that's fair. Plus, you take people that are in here on motor vehicle charges, and you know, they're working off fines because the judge says they have to go and stay in jail. If they're going to work $25 a day off of a sentence, what are they going to have to do? Every day that they stay here, they'll have to pay the extra $4 as room and board and food? We don't think that that's right.
Let me go back to the commissary question and ask you why you think it's unfair that commissary money be used to pay rent.
Well, first of all, a lot of the girls in here stock up on commissary because the food is so terrible we can't eat it. So when we get commissary, that's what we look real forward to on Tuesdays and Fridays, because we know we can get chips and whatever we need, you know, to hold us over till next commissary. Because there's a lot of girls in here that won't even take their trays and eat the food.
How do we deal with the issue, Ms. Bomsey, of repeated complaints about the quality of food and the quality of what a person would be paying for under compulsion?
I think it raises a very interesting question. If we charge people for rent and for their food, do they then have the right, for instance, to insist on a warranty of habitability? If they're sleeping on the floor, if their toilet and their cell leaks, do they have the right not to pay rent?
Well, given the fact that you run a clinic concerned with this issue, it strikes me that while you obviously are opposed to this, you must be thinking strategically about the fact that this may open up avenues for more litigation, a cost to the taxpayers, because now you're in a position to say, look, if I've got to pay for it, you've got to raise the standard that has to be met. Because if anybody's been inside a prison, there is nobody who would voluntarily eat or sleep in a prison if they had a choice. I imagine you agree with that. And so doesn't that mean that you're inviting a lot of suits and litigation around the issue of what quality is being provided in exchange for the payment?
In terms of the standards of care, one should keep in mind that already one can litigate if the standards are cruel and inhumane. Above and beyond that, there's...
The courts have not shown themselves overly receptive to inmate suits about conditions, barring extremes of cruelty or security issues.
Yes.
And doesn't this broaden the avenue? Because if on top of everything else the person is paying for the accommodation or paying a significant part of the cost, yes, they should be entitled to something better.
Ray, you've put your finger on exactly what the distinction is, I think, philosophically, in terms of where Ms. Bomsey and I stand. I believe that philosophically we must look to take care of society first, and that individuals who are going to prison should not view it as a free ride. They should not view it as a night in the Hilton. And the way to make sure that that is the case is to make sure that they understand full well before committing a crime that they're going to have to pay the price, literally as well as figuratively.
Now, what's the cost in the Morris County Jail going to be, for example?
Right now, if you look at the current cost of incarceration, it ranges in our state to a high of $104 a day. If you look at Camden County, Essex is $101, Morris is in a similar range.
I can tell you that while I like to stay in better hotels when I travel, I've stayed in some hotels that were a lot less than that. I mean, we're talking about paying for accommodations that an equivalent dollar would give you a lot better than a Motel 6. And isn't that going to give Ms. Bomsey an opportunity to come into court and say, for what we're paying, we're not getting anything close to that in terms of a fair bargain from people who have no opportunity, no choice?
Well, certainly if anyone wants to look at the fact that we have to have armed guards, which you normally don't need to have when you're staying at a Holiday Inn, there are a number of costs of maintenance, and we'd certainly be willing to look at litigation that could be relieved so that there aren't such inordinate costs today upon municipalities and counties to be compliant with existing law. But to the degree to which we're saying one is in effect extracting a benefit from society, even though it's not a benefit they wish to, namely the cost of incarceration, society as a whole should not bear that cost. Who is being victimized here? The philosophy of the 60s is that it's the criminal who is really the victim. That's just not correct. Society is being victimized by these individuals, and they should pay full freight. The issue isn't that they want to do it, it's that they owe the price to society.
Now, the cost of incarceration remains a constant in the debate about prisons and prison construction and management. Ms. Bomsey, do you think that you'll be looking more carefully at whether the costs being charged really reflect the actual costs, and at whether the facilities are being run in an efficient way? Doesn't that give the inmate a right to get into the books and argue about the question of whether or not the system's being run efficiently?
Well, I would shift the focus somewhat. I think that as I said before, from society's perspective, a lot of this does not make sense. If most people won't have the money to pay in the first place, and you don't only have people who are who are guilty of victimizing society in prison, you have, or in the jails. In the jails, what you have are people who are too poor to raise bail. So those who have committed exactly the same crime but have the money to pay bail will not have to pay
Let me just ask you, is it true, if a person is not convicted, do they have to pay? That is, if I'm in jail waiting trial, I go to trial and I'm acquitted, do I pay or not?
You would not have to pay under this legislation. I'm glad that point is raised.
I understand that.
Okay, go ahead.
However, the person who is found guilty but has had the money to pay bail until he's sentenced will not have to pay his
So two of
sentence.
us are in jail together, but I can get out on bail. You'll have to pay more because you're staying because you're poor.
But if I don't have the money to pay bail, I will now have to pay an additional amount of money for my stay in the county jail. It's absurd from society's perspective.
Doesn't that, in effect, discriminate against people who are poor and who can't pay bail pre-trial?
No, it doesn't. And again, there is a component of the legislation which basically allows discretion to be taken into account by the municipality and/or county to take into account exactly that type of criterion, which is means to pay. But again, we are far afield from what the real issue is. The fundamental issue isn't the particulars of implementation, although I'll gladly discuss those at length. The fundamental issue is, do we believe that those who commit a crime against society should be responsible for paying for the cost society lays out in order to keep those individuals away from society?
Ms. Bartell, the bottom line question for most folks is, when a person comes out of jail, are they better suited to fit into society or not? What impact do you think this will have on the folks you know in the Morris County Jail when they come out, assuming they're going to have to pay rent?
They're not going to be too happy about the situation. Us girls in here figured out that
how much of difficulty would it create if many of those inmates faced liens against future earnings of property as a result of having been faced with this rent?
I don't think they're going to be happy at all about the situation. I don't think they'll pay it. And like they all said, if they don't pay it, what are they going to do? Take them back to court, and then they'll have to go through the system, and then down the road they'll pay for it, you know, when they say they got to pay it.
Does that suggest to you, Assemblyman, that there may be costs associated with the collection of this money that may ultimately make this not an efficient system?
Clearly, there is a cost in terms of imposing a lien. However, what distresses me most in terms of the comments that were just made is there's a willingness to disregard the law once again and to not pay something that is being mandated by the state. It seems to me that there's something fundamentally wrong in our society if we feel that that viewpoint is tolerable in public discourse. If the society such as ours sets a law, it is an inherent responsibility upon all citizens to work to uphold the law. And to the degree to which one flies in the face of that, I think we should deal with it very forcefully.
Ms. Bomsey, go ahead.
Can I say, I think the cost to society is going to be a lot more than just the cost of collecting the money that's owed. I think what we're going to do is ensure that the person who gets out cannot get his or her life together. That should they be able to get a job, we're going to garnish the wages. We're going to take the income tax return that person may get. We're going to guarantee that that person, and probably her children also, will spend a good deal of the rest of their lives incarcerated. So we'll be promoting this incarceration cycle. And the only people who stand to gain from that are those who are part of the criminal justice system. The law enforcement officials, the correction officials, the judges, the lawyers who are part of the system.
Ms. Bartell, I want to ask you a question finally about the potential of another 8% tax on commissary goods that might benefit the Violent Crime Fund. How do you feel about that? Do you feel any differently about that than you do about rent?
No, we'll do anything to get our commissary. Like I said, you know, it's very terrible food here, and if they jacked it up, I believe that everybody would pay that. But what I'm saying is to you is, if an inmate comes to be arrested here at the jail, what's going to happen to him if he doesn't have any money to come into jail? Is he just going to be turned away? He can't come here?
Ms. Bomsey, do you have any different position with respect to the 8% for the victims fund than you do for the rent? Are they both the same and equally objectionable to you?
No, in fact, I can see the justification in the victims' compensation board. I see no justification either from society's perspective or from the inmates' perspective for charging people just because they're poor. I mean, it's economic Darwinism.
When Jim O'Brien calls, who has to run the fund the day after this program airs, and calls your office and says, look, let me leap ahead, I want my 8% even before you start talking about rent, is that something you're willing to do?
I'd be more than happy not only to work for passage of such legislation, but to sponsor it myself, if that would at all be helpful to the process.
And place a higher priority on the 8% than on the rent?
Certainly open to that discussion.
And why is that?
Primarily because I believe that those who are directly victimized by criminals do deserve to receive recompense. But one final point that must be made, and that is we're looking at this backward if we believe that our concern should be, if we put a lien on those who commit crimes, that they will never be able to get out of a cycle of violence. It's on the front end of the process. We have to make sure that we deter individuals.
A lot more to talk about. I wish we could stay and discuss it. I want to thank you, Assemblyman, Ms. Bomsey, Ms. Bartell. Thank you all for being with us. And we hope you'll join us next time for an encore airing of one of our most controversial programs, Should Hard Drugs Be Legal? Former U.S. Surgeon General Jocelyn Elders tells us yes. Newark Mayor Sharp James says no way. That's next time on Due Process. Till then, I'm Raymond Brown.
Any way that the money can be taken from these inmates to compensate, in my opinion, the victim should be compensated. They seem to be falling through the cracks more than anything. They're not getting enough money. They're the ones that these people hurt in one way or another, whether it was by dealing drugs or whether it was by committing a violent crime. Somehow they've hurt people. And anything they own should be at least part of it taken to repay it.
So you'd be with Jim O'Brien on the idea of putting the Violent Crimes Compensation Board first?
Yes, no doubt about it.
In line to be paid?
No doubt about it.
Major funding for Due Process was made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding was provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual, publishers of print and electronic information for and about the legal community, including the legislative manual.